She was forced from power in a coup. Now Myanmar's ousted leader has been sentenced to 4 years in prison. Hundreds, if not thousands more, remain detained for their opposition to the military's takeover. Is Aung San Suu Kyi now the symbol of the junta's desperation to maintain total control? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the sentencing of Aung San Suu Kyi. She spent nearly 15 years in detention, but if Myanmar's military has its way, Aung San Suu Kyi could spend the remainder of her life behind bars. On Monday, a special court in the capital sentenced the ousted leader to 4 years after finding her guilty of incitement and of breaking a natural disaster law. But Yang Hee Lee, the UN's former special rapporteur on human rights in Myanmar, called the charges bogus.
Any trial in Myanmar is not a fair process. The Myanmar does not have an independent judiciary in the first place. And in this situation, under the junta, the SAC is overseeing everything in all the judiciary processes. And therefore, one cannot say it's anywhere near being fair and free and independent.
Suu Kyi is facing a litany of other charges, from the illegal possession of walkie-talkies to taking bribes. If found guilty on all counts, she could be sentenced to more than 100 years in prison. The military has tried to argue it's cracking down on corruption and criminality, but many believe it's simply trying to finish political opponents. Last year, Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy was re-elected in a landslide, easily beating the pro-military opposition. But the army rejected the result, claiming the election was rigged. And on the 1st of February, they seized power, arresting several civilian leaders, including Suu Kyi. Following the coup, Myanmar's membership of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations was called into question. Military leader Min Aung Hlaing was not invited to the annual ASEAN Leaders Summit in October. But on Monday, ASEAN's incoming chairperson, Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Sen, said Myanmar's junta should not be shunned.
We don't compare the rulers in Nai Pitao, Min Aung Hlaing, to the Taliban in Afghanistan. It's a family member of ASEAN. They must have the right to attend meetings. It was strange that the foreign minister from Myanmar wasn't allowed to attend.
Well, the region's acceptance of the new status quo will not be welcomed by those protesting on the streets of Myanmar's cities. Following the junta's hostile takeover, a wave of demonstrations followed. And while security forces were initially restrained, it wasn't long before they were cracking down with force. So far, more than 1,300 people have been killed, including 65 during this protest in March. And Human Rights Watch says the attacks were coordinated.
Without doubt constitutes the crime against humanity of murder. And the reason why we say that is because not only the vast sheer scale of the numbers of people who died, which does constitute a massacre, but also the fact that we can prove through testimonies and digital forensics that in videos posted by security forces and images that show security forces pointing their weapons, assault rifles and automatic weapons against civilians, that this was planned and coordinated.
Well, those protests have continued, and on Sunday, the death toll rose once again as Myanmar's security forces allegedly used a car to ram anti-coup protesters. The military has promised to hold elections in 2023, though many doubt there is a sincere will to hold a vote. So where does this leave the country's decade-long journey toward democracy? To discuss that and more, I'm joined now from London by Maung Zarni, the coordinator of the Free Rohingya Coalition. In Boston is Sochua, a board member for the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights Group and vice president of the now-dissolved Cambodia National Rescue Party. And Phil Robertson is in Bangkok. He's the Deputy Asia Director for Human Rights Watch. Thanks all so much for being with us. Phil Robertson, I first have to ask what you make of this sentence and what you believe the actual motivation is behind, not just the 4 years in prison, but the multiple charges and the multiple trials Aung San Suu Kyi will still face.
Well, we're not surprised at all by the guilty verdicts. In fact, this was pretty clear was going to happen. The courts and the judicial system in Myanmar are far from independent. They have been under the thumb of the Burmese military for many years, and so it was fully expected that she would be found guilty. And in fact, we believe the reason they're doing this is to sideline her, take her out of action, to lock her up indefinitely. The 4 years is just a down payment on that. There's a whole avalanche of other cases that are coming against her. There's an Official Secrets Act case. There's cases on walkie-talkies, owning a legal walkie-talkie. There's actual cases of corruption. There's some things on election fraud. I mean, they're just making it up and throwing at her as it goes because they recognize that if Aung San Suu Kyi was released and if she was able to again contest in another election, she would win that one as well.
Right.
So the Burmese junta wants to put her away. They want to clear her and her party out of the way so that they can continue to hold power.
But would you be at all surprised if they did release her, prematurely, because they could be convicting her just to ensure that she can't run again, because under Myanmarese law, once you're convicted of a crime, you cannot run for political office. Do you think maybe I'm saying there's a longer-term strategy and that they could be using her and the sentence as leverage going forward?
That would imply a degree of subtlety that we have not seen from the Burmese generals, either now or in the past. The reality is that they think that they're right. They think that might makes right, and they think that they have since they have the ability, they should push people out of the way. And they've never been confirmed Democrats in the first part, and I think that ultimately we're going to see them try to dissolve the National League for Democracy Party rather than actually try to negotiate with it.
Okay. Maung Zarni, it's interesting to get your perspective because initially, and you maybe still do believe that Aung San Suu Kyi should have been tried for crimes against humanity the Rohingya population in Myanmar. But in this case, you do believe, if I'm not mistaken, that this sentence, in fact, most of the charges against her, if not all, are entirely unjust.
Yeah, I think it is very important that we separate the two issues here. Aung San Suu Kyi's, well-documented culpability, some would say active complicity in the genocide against the Rohingya people. Remember, this is the politician that stood with the military, not with the victims. And she flew to The Hague back in December of 2019 to defend and deny the genocide allegations perpetrated by the very captor that had pronounced her verdict of 4 years today. But I want to offer a Burmese, the grassroots ground perspective. We look at the Burmese junta not simply as another authoritarian regime in an ASEAN region that is populated largely by authoritarian regimes, including Cambodia, Singapore, and other Thailand and other places. We are looking at the regime that is even unacceptable to the ASEAN as a whole. I understand Hun Sen said that the Burmese junta should be invited. The Burmese people perspective is this, very clear. We feel that the country has entered a period that is more akin to the Nazi-occupied Europe or the fascist-occupied Burma during the Second World War. That's why, it doesn't matter whether they put her Aung San Suu Kyi away, dissolved NLD or National League for Democracy Party, or held elections. They cannot. The military cannot dissolve the society that is up in arms, literally, against the continued military control of the country, close to 60 years. That is the fact. It doesn't. The verdict of this trial does not make or change any Burmese historical development. The society is in full revolution against the military that they view as a Nazi-like terrorist mafia.
Okay. Musuhoa, as someone who's actually faced some similar obstacles to Aung San Suu Kyi as political opposition in a regional neighbor state, that being Cambodia, how have you observed not just the sentence today, but really the events since February 1st in Myanmar?
I see many similar instances where the military in Myanmar and the opposition, the leader of the regime in Cambodia learn from each other. And this is to put away their opponents, to go as far as killing their own people, to go as far as pulling everything that they have to maintain their power. That is not acceptable. The world, the region, every nation should be standing up together with the people of Myanmar. The people of Myanmar have spoken very strongly, and the nationwide civilian disobedience show very clearly where the people of Myanmar are willing to go. People of Myanmar deserve real democracy and to move toward peace, as well as the people in Cambodia and for the region of ASEAN.
There should be solidarity. And initially, it seemed there was solidarity within ASEAN in particular, which was quite remarkable given ASEAN's non-interference policies. So were you outraged then to hear Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Sen actually say he now plans to visit Myanmar and meet with the military junta leaders, and that the junta should be included now in future ASEAN events?
ASEAN must right now make a very strong stance and give a strong message to Mr. Hun Sen, the leader of the Cambodia regime. He is going to chair ASEAN very soon in 2022. It is not just unacceptable. It is against any decisions made by ASEAN by consensus, and he himself made that decision, Mr. Hun Sen. So ASEAN has to right now put a strong statement and make it very clear to Mr. Hun Sen his visit to Myanmar that he has mentioned just today. And in fact, the foreign minister of Myanmar just recently appointed by the military junta is visiting the Cambodia tomorrow. And where is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cambodia right now? In China. Put two and two together. You will see why Mr. Hun Sen is saying what he is saying. Who is talking behind the words of Mr. Hun Sen? China. Let's be clear.
Okay, Maung Zarni, just quickly, I can see you agree. You feel China is certainly pulling some strings here then?
Yes, absolutely. China is the number one player, the vis-a-vis the United States within the ASEAN. And I think Andrea, you're absolutely right when you pointed out that ASEAN took the unprecedented step when it decided to exclude, in other words, not allow the head of the coup junta to attend the ASEAN summit, including the China-ASEAN summit. And what that shows is that this regime is unacceptable even by ASEAN standard. ASEAN is not known for promoting and defending human rights like the European Union and other Western democratic blocs and governments. ASEAN, out of like 10 member states, 8 of them are, variously authoritarian and autocratic, including absolute monarchy in Brunei. And so this is a regime that cannot be accepted even within the already low human rights ASEAN region. And then China is pushing, and Musochu is right. Hun Sen is essentially the proxy for China in the region.
Phil Robertson, I wanted to get your take. I mean, maybe you don't want to dive too deeply into the politics, but the fact that there had been this strong statement from ASEAN, which many say was just unprecedented, given, as I said, its non-interference policy. And some even said that the push to not invite, or the move to not invite Myanmar to the ASEAN summits actually led to the release of the thousands of there's total about 5,000 or more political prisoners in Myanmar right now, and thousands of them were said to be released after ASEAN didn't invite Myanmar. Seemed like progress was being made and that Myanmar was finally giving in to some pressure, but are we misreading that? Is there something else at play here?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, there was supposed to be 5,000 prisoners released. We actually counted probably about several hundred released.
Okay.
So, I mean, what was promised didn't actually come to pass. But the reality is that there is a very strong bloc within ASEAN. This is Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and to a certain extent Brunei and the Philippines, who have said that there has to be real reform within Burma, and there has to be a dialogue with the ASEAN special envoy if they're agreeing to allow the political representatives of the Myanmar junta back into the fold in ASEAN. And we haven't seen anything yet. So I think that, while Hun Sen is saying these things, there's not going to be a consensus around inviting some representative of the Myanmar junta to ASEAN meetings chaired by Cambodia. There may be a big row. And in fact, this is what happened 10 years ago, when in fact, Cambodia was last year, was the only time that ASEAN has ever had a summit meeting of the leaders without a final statement, because of the fighting that went on with Cambodia backing China on the South China Sea issues against Vietnam and others. So I don't think Cambodia wants to see a repeat of what was a clearly failed ASEAN chairmanship 10 years ago. And I think we may see some compromises. I think also you're going to see a lot of pressure coming on ASEAN to hold the line on this political representation question. But it may be that we're not going to get much more out of that. I mean, you're dealing with a very recalcitrant Burmese military regime. There needs to be real pressure on oil and gas revenues, on an arms embargo from the UN Security Council, all those things that have been talked about, but which have not been acted on. And the international community keeps coming out with statements, and, the Myanmar military junta is just yawning.
Okay, Maung Zarni, I saw you had a comment. Go ahead quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, Andrea, I think we need to really pay attention to the fact that there are two regimes in the world today, this year, that the United Nations decided not to see. One is the Taliban, for obvious reason, such a Neanderthal regime in Kabul, and then another one is Myanmar, right in the backyard of ASEAN. So I think the crux of the matter is that we really need to look at the essence, the mode of operation of the Burmese regime in Naypyidaw. They wear the see. This is another unprecedented situation. A national armed forces that was looked up to the Burmese people, at least a majority, as a force for liberation against the Japanese and British, now have morphed into and adopted terroristic methods against civilians. Just yesterday, they used the military vehicles to, not allegedly, there's a video clip yesterday, freshly made, the military ramming itself into, or the vehicle rammed itself into the civilian. If that happened in Istanbul or like Washington, D.C. or London, you will call this a terrorist act, So I think we need to start seeing the terroristic side of the regime. And if we can, I know it's not possible at this point, but if we can get this regime declared terrorist, designated on a terrorist list, I think we're going to start seeing the crack in the regime.
Okay. Let me ask Musuhoa if you think there's any chance of that kind of labeling for Myanmar's regime, and if you think that would be effective, if you agree with Maung Zarni there.
I agree with more sanctions mentioned by Phil. I agree with about solidarity. I agree with strong message and actions from ASEAN, from the UN, to stop this type of atrocity that is happening in Myanmar and listen to the people of Myanmar. I agree that action is supposed to take place now and no more statements. Action. And the world leaders must show their courage in stepping out of the normal business as usual in the country where millions and hundreds and thousands of lives are being destroyed in the most atrocious way. It has to stop. The humanitarian assistance has to flow directly in the hands of organizations in Myanmar. And on the Thai side, the Thai side has to also be put into pressure to allow such humanitarian program.
Understood. Phil, let me ask you this. You know, the UN had said months ago that Myanmar was actually on the brink of collapse. Many would have considered then and both now that, yes, Myanmar is in severe crisis, but really the country, some say, is just more or less in the state it was in before it tried to transition to democracy, and that the military really has just reverted back to what it knows and what it prefers, and that if it gets the recognition of ASEAN back, eventually it can just take up the spot it had before Aung San Suu Kyi took her place in leadership. Do you fear that it could be the path for Myanmar?
I think that the Burmese people are not going to allow that to happen. The major difference between, say, 2004 and 2005 and what we're seeing now in Myanmar is that the Myanmar people have risen against this government in cities and towns across all the major states and ethnic divisions, demanding that the Myanmar military get out and that they respect human rights and that they restore democracy.
And you think they can continue those protests?
There's a real tug of war going on between the military and the people there, where the military is using force, but the people are using economic weapons, the boycotts and the sort of general strike against the Myanmar military regime. And so I think they're pretty evenly matched.
Do you think, though, they can continue with that momentum? I mean, and so much so to actually have push for these elections, at the very least, the elections that are supposed to happen in 2023?
Well, I believe that they will continue this pressure, and I think that actually what is happening to Suu Kyi will prompt even greater outrage amongst the Burmese people. But I don't think necessarily they're going to go for elections in 2023 if they're held under the auspices of the 2008 Constitution or being handled by the military regime, because people don't believe the military regime would run a free and fair election. People want to have the actual democratic government of the NLD restored. They said we voted for that in November 2020 and we want it back.
Right.
No, I think like Andrea, let me just jump in just for 1 second. I think that, the Burmese people are resorting to, homemade weapons, imported weapons, AK-47, M16. We have a zero-sum existential revolution. What is unprecedented is that the society has decided that the world has abandoned them. Security Council has abandoned them. ASEAN has abandoned them. So therefore, they have nothing else, nothing more to lose. They are not prepared to live under the boot again. They would rather die. So we've got doctors, engineers, like hairdressers, journalists taking up arms. So we have networks of women fighters, combat fighters, university graduates and nurses, right? We are killing back what we consider terrorists, the troops in Burma. So I think this regime is not invincible. We are not relying on ASEAN or anywhere else. People
Okay.
are raising money in the diaspora to buy weapons to support this movement. We have a revolution. We better recognize this.
We've heard those reports, Maung Zarni, and the fact that there are armed insurrections, particularly in the rural areas, that are now training civilians. It's hard to substantiate some of those reports. But the fear with that is that the country could descend into civil war. Does that not concern you?
Well, no. We are not descending into civil war. We have been in civil war with the fluctuating intensities. Within 3 months of independence from Britain in 1948, what we are seeing is the mainstream society taking up arms and joining hands with the ethnic minorities that have been up in arms for the last 60 plus years. So what is happening is widening civil war. I wouldn't even call it civil war. It is more like an armed resistance against alien occupational force like fascists. That is how the Burmese people see themselves. We're not even talking about one military regime. We are talking about the entire national military being instrumentalized against the people. So this is a zero-sum revolution.
Okay, Maung Zarni, Musuhoya, Phil Robertson. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated, and thanks to our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. See you next time.